For half the year, the sun barely sets. For the other half, in parts of the country, it barely rises at all. Winters here can plunge deep below freezing for months on end, roads vanish under snow, and darkness can stretch across entire afternoons. By almost any measure, this is one of the harshest climates any large population has ever chosen to call home. And yet more than 5.5 million people live here, not just surviving, but consistently ranking among the happiest, wealthiest, and most content populations on the entire planet. This is Norway, and the story of how a cold, mountainous, resource-poor country turned itself into one of the richest nations in human history is far stranger and far more deliberate than most people realize. Picture a country where a third of the land sits north of the Arctic Circle, where fjords cut so deep into the mountains that some coastal towns only see direct sunlight for a few hours a day in the depths of winter, and where a single winter storm can cut of entire communities for days. Now picture that same country holding more than $2 trillion in a single national investment fund, roughly $400,000 in paper wealth for every man, woman, and child living there. How did a nation this far north, this rugged and this historically poor, become one of the most secure, most equal, and most quietly powerful countries on Earth? Let's get into it. To understand Norway, you first have to understand just how unforgiving its geography actually is. Norway stretches along the western edge of the Scandinavian peninsula, a long, narrow ribbon of land running north to south for well over 2,000 kilometers, roughly the same distance as driving from the southern tip of Spain to the northern edge of Scotland, except this entire stretch is one single country. Much of that land is mountainous, carved by ancient glaciers into deep, steep-walled fjords that slice inland from the coast, some of them plunging more than 1,000 meters below the surface of the water. Norway's coastline, when every fjord and inlet is measured, stretches to a length so extreme it's genuinely difficult to comprehend, one of the longest coastlines of any country on the planet, despite Norway itself being a relatively modest-sized nation by area. That geography creates a climate most people would never willingly choose. A significant portion of Norway lies above the Arctic Circle, where the sun never fully sets for weeks at a time during the height of summer, and never fully rises for a comparable stretch during the depths of winter. In towns like Tromsø, far in the north, residents live through what's known as the polar night, an extended period where the sun stays below the horizon entirely. Daily life carrying on in a kind of perpetual twilight, followed months later by a summer where the sun barely dips down before climbing back up again, turning entire days into a single unbroken stretch of light. Winters across much of the country bring brutal cold, heavy snowfall, and the kind of darkness that, in other parts of the world, would be considered genuinely difficult to build a functioning society around. Even Norway's most iconic natural feature, the fjord, is really a monument to how much this landscape has always demanded of the people living within it. Norway is home to well over 1,000 named fjords, long narrow inlets gouged out by glaciers that retreated thousands of years ago, leaving behind sheer rock walls that in places rise more than a kilometer straight up from the water's edge. Villages tucked into the base of these fjords often exist in a strange kind of geographic isolation, cut off from neighboring communities not by ocean, but by walls of solid stone, connected to the rest of the country only by narrow coastal roads, ferries, or increasingly tunnels blasted directly through the mountains themselves. In the depths of winter, some of these fjord towns receive almost no direct sunlight at all, the sun's low arc blocked entirely by the surrounding cliffs even during the hours it would otherwise be visible. It's a landscape of extraordinary, almost overwhelming beauty. But for the people who actually live there, it has always meant building an entire way of life around terrain that offers very little flat, workable land to begin with. And for most of Norway's history, it was difficult. Long before oil, long before the modern welfare state, Norway was one of the poorer countries in Europe. Its population scattered across small farms, remote fishing villages, and narrow mountain valleys where good farmland was scarce and the growing season short. This wasn't a new struggle. Centuries earlier, that same scarcity of workable land is part of what pushed Norway's Viking ancestors to look outward in the first place, building ships capable of crossing open ocean not purely out of ambition, but partly out of necessity, a homeland that simply couldn't support unlimited population growth on its own. By the time farming, fishing, and small-scale trade had settled into the rhythm of everyday Norwegian life centuries later, that same underlying tension, too many people, not enough usable land, never really disappeared. Life in rural Norway through much of the 19th century meant working land that often couldn't reliably support a family, in a climate that offered little room for error. The pressure became so severe that Norway experienced one of the largest emigration waves relative to its population of any country in Europe. Beginning with a small sloop that departed the port of Stavanger in 1825, carrying a handful of religious dissenters seeking a new life abroad, the trickle eventually became a flood. Over the following century, roughly 1 million Norwegians, out of a population that never reached much beyond 2 million during that era, packed up and left for America, drawn by the promise of open farmland in places like Minnesota and the Dakotas. Proportionally, it remains one of the largest sustained emigrations any European nation experienced during that period, surpassed only by Ireland. An entire generation essentially voted with their feet, choosing the uncertainty of the American frontier over the harsh, unforgiving reality of farming a mountainous northern homeland. The Norway that those immigrants left behind was not yet the wealthy nation the world recognizes today. That transformation began, almost by accident, in the waters of the North Sea. In 1969, after years of largely unsuccessful exploration, drilling crews finally struck a massive offshore oil field, one of the largest ever discovered in that part of the world. IT was a genuinely transformative moment, the kind of discovery that has sent other resource-rich nations spiraling into corruption, inequality, and instability. Norway took a fundamentally different path. Rather than spending the sudden wave of oil revenue as quickly as it arrived, Norwegian policymakers made a decision that, in hindsight, looks almost obvious, but that very few oil-rich nations have ever managed to replicate. They built a sovereign wealth fund, a national savings account designed to convert a temporary, depleting natural resource into a permanent, growing pool of financial wealth, investing the proceeds broadly across global stock and bond markets rather than funneling them directly into domestic spending. A strict fiscal rule limited how much of the fund's returns the government could draw on each year, forcing successive administrations to leave the vast majority of that wealth to keep compounding, rather than treating it as a windfall to be spent immediately. Decade after decade, through oil booms and downturns alike, that discipline held. The results, by now, are almost difficult to fully grasp. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, formerly known as the Government Pension Fund Global but referred to locally as simply the Oil Fund, has grown into the largest single investment fund of its kind anywhere in the world, holding stakes in thousands of companies across dozens of countries. Everything from major technology firms to shipping companies to real estate scattered across global cities. Its total value now sits above $2 trillion, spread across a population of only around 5.5 million people, meaning that, on paper, every single Norwegian citizen holds a notional claim worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000. No one can withdraw their individual share directly. It isn't a personal bank account. It functions instead as a kind of permanent national safety net, a way of ensuring that Norway's prosperity doesn't disappear the moment its oil fields eventually run dry. That wealth, carefully managed rather than simply distributed, funds one of the most comprehensive welfare systems anywhere in the world. Healthcare in Norway is universal, largely funded through taxation rather than private insurance, meaning a serious illness or injury rarely translates into the kind of financial catastrophe families face in less comprehensive systems elsewhere. Higher education, including university, remains free or nearly free for Norwegian residents, removing one of the largest financial barriers that shapes life decisions in many other wealthy countries, and allowing young Norwegians to choose a course of study based on genuine interest rather than which degree offers the best chance of paying off crushing student debt. Parental leave policies rank among the most generous on the planet, offering new parents roughly a year of paid time off between them, split flexibly between both parents, built around the widespread expectation that raising children shouldn't come at the cost of a career, or marriage, or a family's financial stability. Unemployment support, elder care, and disability assistance follow the same underlying philosophy, that a wealthy society's basic obligation is to make sure no single misfortune, a lost job, a difficult birth, a serious diagnosis, is enough to permanently derail someone's life. None of this comes without cost. Norwegian taxes rank among the highest in the world, with income tax rates that would strike many outsiders as steep, layered on top of a value-added tax applied to most everyday purchases. It's a trade-off most Norwegians appear to accept as the price of a system that provides real, tangible security in return, a system built on remarkably high levels of public trust in government and institutions, trust that took generations to build and that Norwegians seem determined not to squander. Surveys consistently find that Norwegians report higher confidence that their tax money is being spent responsibly than citizens of most other wealthy nations, a belief reinforced by the transparency built directly into how the oil fund itself operates, with its holdings, returns, and ethical investment guidelines published openly for any citizen to examine. But wealth alone doesn't fully explain how Norwegians actually live, day to day, in a climate this demanding. Much of that comes down to culture, and to a set of unwritten rules that shape Norwegian life just as powerfully as any law on the books. There's a long-standing cultural norm, often referred to informally as the law of Jante, that discourages individuals from believing themselves better or more important than anyone else in the community. It's an idea baked deeply into Norwegian social life, one that helps explain why extreme displays of wealth remain fairly rare here, even in a country with this much money sitting in reserve, and why a strong sense of equality permeates everything from workplace culture to how children are raised. That same culture places enormous value on time spent outdoors, regardless of season or temperature. Norway maintains something called the right to roam, a long-standing legal principle that allows anyone, resident or visitor, to walk, hike, ski, or camp across most of the country's uncultivated land, regardless of who technically owns it, as long as it's done responsibly. Combined with widespread access to mountains, forests, and coastline, this has helped build a national culture deeply oriented around nature. One where hiking in summer and cross-country skiing in winter aren't niche hobbies, but genuinely mainstream intergenerational activities. Skiing itself, in fact, isn't just popular here. The very word, and quite possibly the sport in its earliest form, traces directly back to Norway, where wooden skis were essential winter transportation across mountainous terrain for thousands of years before anyone thought to turn them into a competitive pastime. Hundreds of thousands of families across the country maintain small, simple mountain or coastal cabins, often without electricity or running water even today, treating a weekend spent chopping firewood and skiing across open snowfields as a cherished escape rather than a hardship. These cabins, known locally as Hytta, are woven so deeply into national identity that entire school and work calendars bend around them, with a widely observed spring break built specifically around a week of mountain skiing that empties whole cities as families head for higher, snowier ground. It's a striking contrast. A country wealthy enough to buy almost any comfort imaginable, where huge numbers of citizens still choose, quite deliberately, to spend their free time hauling water and splitting wood in a remote cabin with no modern plumbing, precisely because that simplicity is treated as valuable in itself, not as a burden to be escaped. Work culture reflects a similar philosophy. The standard work week in Norway runs shorter than in many other wealthy nations, and Norwegian workplaces generally place a strong emphasis on maintaining a genuine boundary between professional and personal life, an expectation reinforced by generous vacation allowances and a cultural resistance to the kind of always-on, overtime-heavy work culture common elsewhere. Gender equality runs deep here too, reflected in some of the highest rates of female workforce participation in the world, supported directly by that same robust parental leave system and widely available. Heavily subsidized childcare that makes returning to work after having children a realistic option rather than a financial calculation, most families struggle to justify. Beyond oil and the wealth fund, Norway's economy runs on a mix of industries shaped directly by its geography. The same fjords and cold coastal waters that make farming difficult have made Norway one of the world's largest exporters of farmed salmon, a booming aquaculture industry built almost entirely around conditions most other countries would consider a disadvantage, turning cold, sheltered fjord waters into some of the most productive fish farming sites on the planet. Norway's extensive network of rivers and steep mountain terrain also generates nearly all of the country's electricity through hydropower, giving Norway one of the cleanest domestic electricity grids of any major economy on Earth. A quiet irony for a nation whose modern wealth was built substantially on oil and gas exported to the rest of the world. The clean domestic grid has also made Norway one of the global leaders in electric vehicle adoption, with battery-powered cars now making up the overwhelming majority of new vehicle sales in the country, a shift accelerated by generous incentives funded, in part, by the very oil revenue the technology is ultimately meant to replace. Shipping, too, remains a major industry, a legacy stretching back through Norway's long maritime history as a seafaring nation shaped from the very beginning by a coastline that made the sea, rather than the road, the most natural way to travel, connecting isolated fjord communities to each other and to the wider world centuries before any modern road network existed. None of this means life in Norway is without real difficulty. The cost of living remains among the highest anywhere in the world. Groceries, restaurants, and everyday goods routinely surprising visitors used to cheaper economies elsewhere. A simple dinner out in Oslo often costing significantly more than an equivalent meal in most other European capitals. Housing, particularly in cities like Oslo and Bergen, has become increasingly expensive, squeezing younger Norwegians even in a country this wealthy overall, pushing many towards smaller apartments, longer commutes, or longer wait before they can afford to buy rather than rent. And, despite the country's prosperity, the same harsh winters and long stretches of darkness that shaped Norwegian culture for centuries still take a genuine psychological toll for some residents, a reality openly discussed rather than dismissed, addressed through public health awareness, widespread use of vitamin D supplementation during the darkest months, and a cultural emphasis on getting outdoors even in the coldest, darkest weather rather than staying inside and waiting for spring. There's a well-known Norwegian saying that captures this attitude directly, the idea that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing, a mindset instilled in children from the earliest years of school, where recess often continues outdoors regardless of rain, snow, or biting wind. There's also a deeper, longer-term question hanging over the country. Norway's population growth has slowed considerably in recent years, and its birth rate has fallen to one of the lowest levels the country has recorded in a generation. A demographic pattern echoing across much of the wealthy world, but carrying particular weight in a country whose entire long-term financial planning depends on future generations to sustain it. And the same oil wealth that built modern Norway now sits at the center of an uncomfortable national conversation. A country that has profited enormously from fossil fuels, whilst also positioning itself as a global leader on climate policy and renewable energy. A contradiction Norwegians themselves debate as openly as anyone. What makes Norway's story genuinely remarkable isn't simply that it found oil at the right moment, since plenty of countries have struck it rich and squandered the opportunity entirely. It's that a nation shaped for centuries by hardship, by poverty severe enough to send 1 million of its own citizens across an ocean in search of a better life, responded to sudden wealth with patience rather than excess, discipline rather than short-term indulgence. The same values that helped small fishing communities survive brutal winters, generation after generation, careful planning, shared responsibility, a deep suspicion of anyone getting too far ahead of everyone else, turned out to be exactly the values needed to manage a fortune large enough to reshape an entire nation's future. In the end, Norway's real achievement was never simply extracting oil from beneath the North Sea. It was deciding, deliberately and repeatedly, not to let that fortune change who they fundamentally were. A country built by people who once had almost nothing to work with beyond stubbornness and the ability to endure a long, dark winter, chose to turn sudden wealth into permanence rather than indulgence, security rather than spectacle. That, more than the size of the fund or the price of oil, may be the real reason millions of people continue to choose one of the harshest climates on Earth as exactly where they want to call home. If Norway's journey from mass emigration to the world's largest sovereign wealth fund surprised you, subscribe. Because there are plenty more stories out there about how countries turn their hardest challenges into their greatest strengths.